All right, 7th graders. So today for the whole lesson, you guys will be doing a little activity called Animal Adaptations. I think this is one of my favorite parts about teaching life science to 7th graders, or really anyone, is that you guys have some awesome organisms that live around you or in the world that maybe you don't know about, or some you maybe know about, and they can do awesome things just to survive. Okay, so that's really going to be our focus on today, is looking at those adaptive and non-adaptive traits, but mainly the adaptive ones that help organisms survive in their environment. And remember again that an environment is anything living or non-living surrounding that organism. So we could be looking at things like predators, okay, living organisms surrounding that organism. It could be prey, okay, if we're a predator looking at the prey that surrounds us. Or maybe even just things like climate, living in a desert, there's some extreme conditions there that you guys have to deal with, or living in the Arctic where it's very cold. How do animals or organisms adapt there? Okay, so you're learning targets. I can describe the 3 different types of adaptations, and I can describe how adaptive traits make an individual more likely to survive and reproduce, and how non-adaptive traits make an individual less likely to survive and reproduce. Okay, so let's just kind of start by defining an adaptation. So an adaptation is something an organism has or does. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily have to be born with it. It could be something it learns, but it can also be described as an action it does as well. That makes them more likely to survive and reproduce in their environment. So there are 3 types of classifications of an adaptation that we're going to look at. So we can see behavioral, we can see physical, or we can see physiological. And I'll go through, this is kind of the fun part of the lesson, I think, go through what these are and give you guys some cool examples of these, and then you guys will be finding some examples on your own. All right, so physical adaptations, these are adaptive traits an organism is born with. I put born in quotations because not all organisms are born. If we're looking at a plant, okay, a plant certainly is an organism. It certainly has traits, both adaptive and non-adaptive, to help it survive, but like I said, it's not really born. Okay, so that was why born was in quotations. So they're adaptive traits an organism is born with that allows them to adapt to their environment. An organism doesn't get to choose these, unfortunately. For some, those traits might be more non-adaptive than they are adaptive, but obviously we're focusing on more of the adaptive traits today. So here are your examples of physical adaptations I gave to you guys. So I'm just going to kind of go through some of these pictures. Some of them are obvious, some of them are not so obvious. So let's take a look at the obvious ones. We've got the porcupine. The porcupine has a beautiful defense system that it is born with, which is of course these quills covering its body. So if a predator tries to attack it, it gets poked a lot. Okay, so that prevents other organisms from really preying on porcupines a whole lot. Okay, polar bears, they live in extremely cold environments, and they hunt in the water as well. So they have a ton of different adaptations to help them survive and reproduce in these cold environments and allow them to hunt and just exist, like thick fur, lots of blubber, their pads on their feet. I just can imagine walking around in the cold like that with my feet out. Okay, that's a fun one. If you guys look at giraffe, that one's pretty obvious as well. You guys have their long neck, which allows them to eat food at the top of trees, whereas other animals are competing for food lower down on trees. And so they just don't have a whole lot of competition except with other giraffes as to where they get their food source, which where they live, food can sometimes be scarce and hard to come by. Okay, cactus, that one's pretty obvious. You guys have a lot of different adaptations again with a cactus, where you guys have all the spines that prevent other animals from eating it. Those spines also have a lot of adaptations as far as water conservation. There's a wax that the cactus produces that helps it conserve water. Their root system helps them get water and conserve it as well. Okay, this little lizard, not really sure what his name is, but you guys can see he has some pretty rad camouflage. And it's just something he's born naturally with, and it allows him to fit into his environment. Okay, I put the picture of these 2 ducks for 2 reasons. Okay, as we just did a little activity called the bird beak lab, you guys obviously know that a duck has a beak that's specifically suited for the kind of food that it eats. So that's an adaptation in and of itself, whereas a hummingbird has a long skinny beak to allow it to get nectar out of flowers. You guys can see some aquatic birds have kind of almost a weird paddlefish beak to allow them to eat aquatic plants deep in the water. Things like storks, they have the big beak or the big bill for scooping up water and fish. So you guys know obviously a lot about beaks. This is a cool one. So this picture right here is actually a bird bone. Okay, and birds in and of itself are just one big walking or flying, in this case, adaptation. So one of the reasons birds can fly is because their skeletal system is so light. It's not built like a normal animal skeletal system. So if you guys take a look at that, this is a cross section of a bird bone, and this is one of the reasons you guys aren't supposed to feed like chicken bones to dogs, is because if you look on the inside, they're not solid bones. They're really, really thin. A good portion of them is hollow, but the ends of their bones, whereas ours would be compact bone as we call it, is really, really spongy, barely a web-like structure. So it gives them enough structure that they need, but unfortunately it does make their bones really fragile. But if their bones were built like ours, they would not be able to fly. Okay, so their bones in and of itself are an adaptation that allows them to fly, among many other things like feathers, wings, stuff like that. Okay, and then, I forgot to address the other part with the ducks. So the second reason with the ducks that they have a really great adaptation is if you guys look at whether they're male or female, they have different physical appearances, and part of that has to do with mating, but also part of that has to do with protecting their young. So oftentimes the female duck will sit with the eggs and the baby ducks, and then the male duck kind of sticks around the area to act as a distraction. So if other animals come to where they're nesting, they'll take notice of the male duck and follow that versus finding the female duck with all the young. So that's part of their color as well. It's almost kind of like a little camouflage, anti-camouflage partnership that they got going on there. Okay, and then this is one of my favorite ones. This is an example of what we call mimicry. So with mimicry, you guys have an organism that looks like another organism. So if you guys just kind of look at this at a glance, what do you think that organism looks like? Obviously, if you look closely, you know it's a butterfly, or in this case, a moth. I think it's actually a butterfly. But if you look, it kind of reminds me of owl eyes. And so this bug uses this idea of mimicry to kind of camouflage itself in a way because it looks like something that's a dangerous predator. Okay, people or animals would see that and they think they see an owl, which is generally a predator, and they would avoid eating this little butterfly here because they don't want to mess with the predator. There's a lot of other cases of mimicry. For instance, some butterflies will look like other breeds of butterflies that are poisonous to eat. So they've just kind of developed traits where they have similar appearances, things like that. There's a type of lizard that has a blue tongue, and a lot of times in nature, animals associate bright colors with poison. And this lizard isn't poisonous at all, but if it's being threatened, it'll flash open its mouth up really wide and flash its blue tongue. And then whatever that predator is will think it's poisonous because of that bright blue tongue and run away from it. Okay, same with poison dart frogs. A lot of organisms in a jungle know not to mess with those poison dart frogs because they have that really bright color that indicates that they're poisonous. Okay, so those are just some examples of physical adaptations. Again, these organisms are born with these. They don't get to change them. They can't influence them in any way. It's just kind of how they look physically or how they're built physically. It could be something as simple as a lion having a muscular structure that allows it to run after an organism, or a cheetah and the way its bones and muscles are built to make it so fast. Okay, so those are all physical adaptations. Okay, behavioral adaptations, they could be instinctual, so they could be born with them, or they can be something that could be developed over time. So these are adaptive traits an organism does to survive. Okay, so again, these organisms are knowingly doing this action to survive. They can be an instinct, or they can be born with them, or they can learn them. So here are some examples of these. So if we look, diurnal is a word that describes animals or organisms that come out during the day, versus, you guys know, nocturnal are organisms that come out at night. And there's oftentimes many reasons why an organism comes out at night. For instance, hunting is usually a big one, but if you're looking at places like the desert, some organisms are nocturnal just to avoid the heat of the daytime. Okay, so there's a lot of reasons. Obviously, you guys have a bat doesn't have great eyesight, so it really doesn't have a need to hunt during the day. So it'll come out at night and then use its special radar as a way of hearing its prey and hunting there. Okay, a picture of wolves and a bison here. They hunt as a pack. Okay, something similar to that, so that's how they behave to get their food and survive. Something similar here, and this is one of my favorite ones. If you guys get a second, go look up a video on YouTube of killer whales hunting. When they have a big school of fish like this, they will do all kinds of crazy things to kind of herd the fish up. So each whale in this little hunting party has a different task that it has to do. Like one spins around them or swims around them, they blow bubbles, they try to confuse the fish, and then they group them all together, and then they'll each take turns going through the middle of the herd of that fish to just open their mouth and eat. Okay, so they get really concentrated ways of eating. Penguins, with their reproduction, obviously they live in really extreme environments, so their behavior after they're done mating, when they lay an egg, the male carries that egg around between their legs to keep it warm. So that's a big behavioral thing. More than anything, I don't know if this is a great survival adaptation. I just thought the picture was kind of funny, and it is, in fact, a survival adaptation. So a lot of organisms have ways of warning predators that they shouldn't mess with them. And I just think opossums are funny. So they hiss and they screech and they yell and they open their mouth up really wide to warn their predators off. I don't know how well it actually works, but I sure do like the pictures. Okay, a lot of organisms migrate. Picture of geese right here migrating. It's also a behavior that they fly in that V shape. So here's the question for you guys at home. Why is one side of the V, if you guys look at a V of geese in the sky, why is one side of the V longer than the other? Okay, something to think about for a second. The answer is because there's more geese in it. I gotcha. No, but they fly in a V like that because it reduces the amount of wind resistance they have. It's a little, I think it's called drafting. I think I'm getting the word wrong right now. You normally can think of it, but I'm drawing a blank. But I think it's drafting, where it just reduces the amount of wind resistance. So they each take turns being the point. And since they're flying such a long ways, they need to kind of conserve their energy as much as possible. So this is their method of flying to do so. Okay, this is probably one of my favorite adaptations for an animal, and you guys will see this in a video later. But if you guys didn't know this, octopus are masters of disguise. Okay, they can not only change their color when they're trying to hide from a predator or a threat, but they can also change the texture of their skin. So they have these little chromatophores in their skin where they can contract and lose some color and then relax other chromatophores and change their color by contracting these different colored cells in their skin. And then they also have these little textures and spikes that they can contract muscles and kind of make these little protrusions all over their body, or they can smooth their body out. So for being an invertebrate and not really having a whole lot going on, that's a pretty cool adaptation for that animal. A lot of organisms hibernate in the winter. A lot of them do that for their reproduction, as well as being able to conserve energy when in the months where their food supply is pretty low. Okay, so there's a picture of bears. They also do a lot of behavioral things prior to hibernating, like building up protein in their body and their diets and stuff to help them be able to hibernate. Okay, some cool, if you guys haven't seen this before, this is a bird of paradise. There's a lot of different species of birds of paradise, but one of my favorite things that they do is their mating ritual. So you guys can see this is a female. She kind of gets the short end of the stick as far as beauty goes. But she's a female bird, and this is the male bird. He basically contorts his body and his feathers to do this crazy little dance. Again, you guys can look it up. We just watched a video not too long ago. There's some on Planet Earth that you guys can watch and see how they kind of do their little mating dance. And then, again, not a super great adaptation, but sloths here. Okay, sloths don't have a whole lot going for them genetically. But one adaptation that they surprisingly have is their speed. Obviously, they're not super speedy and can't get away from things, but because they move so slow, and part of why they move so slow, koalas as well, is because they have a really poor diet and they don't digest things really well. Again, overall, not a very well adapted animal, but because they move so slow, it prevents predators from seeing them so easily. So the things that you would think would get them killed faster are actually some of the things that help them survive. All right. And last but not least, and probably the hardest to understand, is physiological adaptations. So when we talk, maybe you guys have an older sibling that's in high school and they're taking anatomy and physiology. Anatomy is kind of like what the body part is, and physiology is how it works. So these are little processes that occur in our body. For instance, you guys eating a cheeseburger and it going into your stomach and you digesting it and then using those nutrients for food, that's physiology. So these are the processes that an organism's body does to help them survive. Like physical adaptations, the organism does not get to choose them. So you guys don't get to choose the fact that you're warm-blooded. Okay, so let's talk about a couple of these. I'll go ahead and start with that. So this is an image that shows you guys warm-blooded versus cold-blooded organisms. And we are warm-blooded because it suits our environment and what we do, and same with a lot of warm-blooded organisms. Oftentimes you guys see cold-blooded animals in really, really warm environments like the desert. Okay, so this again is an image. You obviously see a little lizard. You guys can see its temperature, so it's a thermal scan, where its temperature is a lot cooler than the human hands. Okay, the human being and other warm-blooded animals maintain a body temperature. Okay, if our body starts to get cold, we start to shiver to try to keep our body warm. And if we get too hot, we start to sweat to try to cool our body down, but we maintain that 98.6 degree temperature. Okay, whereas a reptile or other cold-blooded animals, they can't do that with their body. Okay, on one hand, it's helpful for us to always have the same body temperature, but it takes a lot of energy to keep that body temperature. Okay, so on the other hand, for like a reptile or other cold-blooded animals, they don't have to expend that energy, and oftentimes it's beneficial for them because they don't have to expend that energy, and they live in places like the desert where it's really hot and they get a lot of sun. They're kind of like little solar panels. They don't have to worry too much about being in situations where, you know, their body's not functioning properly because it's too cold. Okay, so that's the difference between warm-blooded and cold-blooded, and that's a physiological. They can't control that in our body, like we can't control when we shiver or when we sweat. Okay, that's just how our body works. Production of venom. So you guys obviously see a venomous snake right here. That production in venom is something that those snakes can't control. It's just something that happens naturally in their body, but it is a good defense mechanism and a good adaptation. Mammals and their ability to produce milk to feed their young. Okay, they can nurture their young in ways that other organisms can't necessarily do, especially since their young stick around them and are very dependent on them for a while. So again, that's not something that a mammal can control. You can't control how much or when you produce milk. That's just something that happens in their body. Okay, I'm going to skip this one and come back to it. This little guy should look familiar to you guys. That's a rough skin newt. We've been learning a lot about them, and their skin produces that poison, that tetrodotoxin, that we, again, have been learning about and will keep learning about in this unit. Birds, physiologically, they lay their eggs. That way they don't have to carry their young with them. Again, we kind of talked about their bones being so light, and that allows them to be able to fly. If they carried their young like a mammal did, they wouldn't be able to fly as easily. Sorry, got a little announcements there. This one's a little bit of physical, a little bit of physiological as well, but this is the snowshoe hare, and it changes its color of its fur to suit the season. So in the summer months where it's more brown and green in the environment, it is a brown color, and then obviously in the winter when it snows, it turns white. So a little bit of physical, a little bit of physiological. A camel's water storage and what it does in its body to store and conserve water is pretty insane. But this one I think is pretty cool. So this is a wood frog. It's found a lot in northern areas, but they basically freeze to death and then can come back to life when they thaw. And so that's a really cool adaptation to survive winters. Obviously you don't see a whole lot of frogs hopping around. A lot hibernate to survive, but this one can straight up freeze. It has organs in its body, or the ability in some of its organs of its body to produce a lot of glucose in its blood, and that glucose basically makes the blood really thick and prevents it from dying when it freezes, and makes it harder for it to freeze. A lot of different organisms as well, fish especially, can produce almost like an antifreeze chemical that when their body gets really cold and their body starts to freeze and their blood starts to freeze, those little antifreeze chemicals can go and prevent that from happening. So a lot of cool adaptations physiologically there as well. All right, so there's 3 parts to this assignment that you guys will complete. So let's learn about some other organisms and their unique adaptations that help them survive. On each of the following slides, choose one listed organism to research and answer questions on its adaptations. So part 1 I'm going to kind of do with you guys. You're going to right-click the link. You're going to open this link up. I'm going to allow you guys to pause this video first and watch it, and then I'll kind of walk through this really disgusting but awesome adaptation here. Sorry, let me skip this ad. So this is the blood-shooting eyes, the world's weirdest. It's the horned lizard. Okay, so pause this video, watch this little video on the horned lizard. It's only about 2.5 minutes long, and then come on back, and we will talk about it. All right, so you're going to fill out slides like this. The organism, in this case, there was only one, so you don't have a choice on this one. It was the horned lizard. Its adaptation is that it has several adaptations, actually. So in this case, the adaptation is that it can shoot blood from its eyes. Okay, it can also roll over. It has that spiked external shell. It can puff itself up to make it look a little bit bigger. So it has a lot of different adaptations. So kind of talk about those adaptations there. And then what type of adaptations, if we're talking about its physical appearance, its little pokey skeleton or its camouflage, those would be physical. Behavioral would be how it puffs up or rolls over. And then its physiological, it was obviously part of it is shooting the blood out of its eyes. That's kind of a crazy little physiology, but that's also a behavioral one as well. So you guys have a couple different options there. So choose an adaptation to talk about, and then tell me what type or types of adaptation that is. Again, some of these adaptations may be more than one type. It may be physical and physiological. Might be behavioral and physiological, okay? Might be physical and behavioral, whatever the case is. Might be all 3 of them. So if you guys can justify it, circle them, okay? All right, so go to this link right here. This link is a little reading link, so you guys will get all your information there. This is 20 amazing animal adaptations for living in the desert. So you guys can see a lot of different ones, like for instance, the fennec fox. So scroll through this, find one that you guys want to talk about, type in which organism you chose here, talk about its adaptation or adaptations, and then tell me whether those are physical or if they are what type they are, physical, behavioral, physiological, or more than that. Okay, you're going to do the same thing for part or organism 2. Go to the link right here. It's going to be 10 rare animals with bizarre adaptations. So again, you guys can kind of look through those, pick the one you want, tell me about the adaptations, and then the types. This one is, I think, 7 bizarre ones. You guys can see you guys have some really cool ones to pick from here. So you're just going to learn about them. And then finally, this last one, organism 4, is some plants that you guys would see in and around, not necessarily in and around Montana, but some of them are. But like the pitcher plant is really cool. All right, finally, part 2. For each of the 2 animals described on the next slides, think of 3 different adaptations to help it with its problem. So it's going to tell you about its problem. Your adaptations should be a natural type of adaptation, so you can't just strap a flashlight to the head of an animal so that it can see better at night. You must complete an annotated illustration of one of the animals and their 3 adaptations. So you guys should draw the animal, how kind of incorporating those 3 adaptations that you came up with, and then label those adaptations. Okay, so on this one, here's animal A. It's a yellow and orange clownfish that lives in a dark green tropical coral, so obviously it doesn't blend with its environment. It needs some protection from larger fish that prey on it. Its major food source is dying off, and new food sources live in deeper, colder waters. Other small fish at this water level tend to swim faster than this clownfish can swim. So it's got several problems there. So tell me about its problems. And then tell me what adaptations you guys came up with and how they help. So for each adaptation, you need to also tell me how that adaptation is going to help it survive. Okay? Part 2, animal B is a small mammal living in the forest that has trouble finding food at night. It hides during the day. It has yellow fur and is hunted easily by 3 different species of predators in its environment. So again, tell me about that animal's problems. What are 3 adaptations that you guys could come up with and how they would help it survive? And then finally, choose one of those two animals, animal A, animal B. Draw a picture of it on a clean white piece of paper. Make sure to label those adaptations as you guys have drawn them on that animal. And then you guys can go ahead and take a picture of it, insert it right here. And finally, to wrap up today's assignment, you're going to watch this awesome video. It's one of my favorite ones I think I show. It's called Extreme Survivors. You guys get to learn a little bit more about an octopus. It's about 45 minutes long. So watch that, and if you guys choose, you guys can take notes for extra credit. Just a page will do. If you're at home, you guys can do that on a piece of notebook paper. Send me a picture of it, or you guys can do it in a Word document and send me a picture. That's fine. Whatever works for you. And then you have adapted very nicely to this assignment. Great job. Go ahead and hand it in, and I hope you are having a great day. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.